We begin our quarter discussing beginning of life issues, but it should stand out that we aren't dealing actually with the immorality of abortion. This is an issue in our own society that gets a lot of attention in the media and in politics. It's actually one of the less interesting issues in medical ethics. Recall the earlier podcast in which we saw that one way to resolve moral disagreement is to come to an agreement on the accepted definitions of crucial terms. Many people think that the abortion debate can go no further until each side can agree on what constitutes a person. One side holds that a fetus in the first trimester is a person, or an even stronger claim that at conception a person is created. So even the embryo itself is a person. The other side holds that a fetus in the first trimester is not yet a person, but becomes one perhaps in the second or third. You can see why there would be disagreement, since one side sees the killing of a person with any abortion, while the other side sees a killing only in the second or third trimester. Notice that both sides agree that the unjustified killing of a person, that is murder, is wrong. They just disagree about whether all abortions are unjustified killings of persons. Some people have argued that this way of thinking, the disagreement is wrong. Judith Jarvis Thomson, in her paper included in our textbook, argues that even if we accept the claim that a fetus is a person at conception, it doesn't thereby follow that all abortions are wrong. Refer to that paper if you're interested in how she argues for this. It's also full of great and famous examples that test our intuitions. And Ronald Dworkin, in his book Life's Dominion, argues that when it comes down to it, the disagreement is not about whether fetuses are persons, but about the sacredness of life. He claims that if we think of the issue in terms of personhood, it obscures the more central issue of how we should treat living beings, which is really what people are disagreeing about in discussions of abortion. I'm going to presume that people have had or could have had the opportunity to learn about the moral issues surrounding abortion in either Introduction to Philosophy or Contemporary Moral Problems. For this reason, I don't include this particular issue in this course. However, the issue still looms large when we begin to think about prenatal screening for certain diseases. The larger issue of whether any abortions are morally permissible or not is certainly relevant here, but the possibility of abortion can become morally significant more narrowly when we talk about prenatal genetic screening. We now have the capability to determine how likely a fetus is to have certain diseases. The most common form of detection is what's called amniocentesis. Pregnant women over the age of 35 are given this test as a matter of course, though younger women now are encouraged to get the test as well. The primary purpose of this test is to determine whether the fetus has any ailments that will either complicate pregnancy or result in debilitating disease after birth. So what is to be done if a woman learns that the fetus has a certain ailment? The main choice here is between aborting the pregnancy or not. And abortion in this context is what is called selective abortion. But this, I hope you can see, is more complex than the general discussion of abortion. Even if someone thinks that abortion is not universally morally prohibited, he can still hold that getting an abortion because someone has learned that her child has a certain disease is morally wrong. The issue here is narrower. Someone who thinks that abortion is always impermissible, or conditionally permissible in cases of rape or incest, will hold that abortions resulting from the learning of disease via prenatal testing are wrong. But someone who thinks that some abortion is permissible still has to determine whether abortion as a result of information learned from prenatal testing is permissible or not. This issue is, of course, very complicated as well. Some people argue that even if the fetus is not harmed, selective abortion like this sends harmful messages to different individuals. There is, first, people who have the same ailments as the fetuses are determined to have. Take an example. If Mary aborts a pregnancy because she learns that her fetus has Down syndrome, this decision can actually harm John, it's argued, who has Down syndrome when he learns about it. The message John receives is that Mary thinks it's better not to be alive than to be alive with Down syndrome. Thus, it's argued, John is harmed by Mary's decision. Or suppose that Mary already has a daughter, Joan, who witnesses Mary's decision to abort after she learns the fetus has a debilitating condition. Joan may begin to wonder whether Mary's treatment of her will change if Joan can contract some similar disease later in life. Maybe Mary will stop caring for Joan like a mother if Joan gets the disease, since there seems to be a health threshold for inclusion in the family. A question you might ask yourself here is, do you think that Mary's decision can harm John or Joan in the way I've just described? Now, these examples force us to ask whether anyone else could be harmed by a person's decision to abort a fetus that is determined to have a debilitating disease. We're going to see a little bit later how this kind of discussion occurs. But they also assume that the abortion occurs, requiring us to consider what harm accrues to others as a result of the abortion. What about the harm that occurs if the abortion doesn't happen? Most importantly, what harm would accrue to the infant that is born should abortion not occur and the pregnancy goes full term? There are some horrendously painful conditions that we're going to talk about that are detected using prenatal testing. One of these is called Tay-Sachs disease. And infants rarely live very long, usually no longer than 1 month, sometimes a few months. In those cases, the infant becomes blind, deaf, and eventually unable to swallow. Muscles begin to atrophy, paralysis sets in until the infant eventually dies. This is a horrible existence for a person to undergo, and for many people, this case of Tay-Sachs is the paradigm for selective abortion. Another condition, called spina bifida, results in the spines not connecting up, so that some babies are born with a spinal cord protruding through the skin. Others are born with internal organs being exposed or showing signs of hydrocephalus, a condition marked by excessive fluid and pressure around the brain. Both of these conditions result in pain and suffering of the infant, generally ending in death within a few months. There are other illnesses and conditions, including Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, and an illness that occurs later in life, what's called Huntington's disease, all of which can be detected through some sort of prenatal genetic screening or through the use of amniocentesis, and these should be considered as well. So what a utilitarian perspective on this issue, then, as we're thinking about ethical theories and how they would handle this. Would a utilitarian perspective on this issue conclude that abortion is the right thing to do, since more suffering results from taking the pregnancy full term? We have to consider not only the infant suffering, but the family suffering as well, right? Because remember, utilitarianism takes into account the well-being, the pleasure of all those affected. And the family, presumably, since they're having to watch all this unfold, they too will suffer. We might ask what a Kantian would determine here. We might ask what a virtue theorist would say. And we also might imagine how ethics of care could handle this notion of how selective abortion works, who it harms, and how we can potentially mitigate the harm, either by getting the selective abortion or by not. These are things to consider as we get into the following articles dealing with prenatal genetic screening.